Elias Ward pulled his truck to the shoulder when he saw the police cruiser with its hood up, smoke curling into the cold December air. He told Juniper to stay buckled and stepped out into the wind. The officer turned at the sound of his boots on gravel, and when she removed her sunglasses, the world stopped. Mara Keaton, the woman who had walked out of his life 10 years ago without explanation, leaving wounds he thought he had buried. Now she stood in front of him, while his 7-year-old daughter sat in the truck behind him, oblivious to the storm that had just begun. The woman standing beside the disabled cruiser looked older than the girl he remembered, her face sharper, her posture rigid in the winter light. But the eyes were the same, dark brown, guarded, searching his face the way they used to when she was trying to decide whether to tell him the truth or a version of it. Her locks were pulled back into a neat bun at the nape of her neck, professional and contained, so different from the way she used to wear them loose around her shoulders. Mara spoke first, her voice steady but low. She said his name like a question. Elias nodded once, not trusting himself to say anything yet. Behind him, Juniper shifted in her booster seat, humming one of the gospel songs Ruth had taught her. The sound reminded him where he was, what he was doing, and how badly he wanted to get back in the truck and drive away. But he didn't. He walked toward the cruiser, his boots crunching on gravel. Mara stepped back, giving him space to look under the hood. Steam rose from the radiator, and he could see the split hose before she said anything. It was a simple fix, the kind of thing that shouldn't have stranded anyone. But out here on Route 12, help didn't come quickly. Elias asked if she had called for a tow. Mara said she had, but it would be at least an hour. She didn't ask him to stay. She just stood there with her arms crossed, watching him the way someone watches a stranger they're trying to place. It made him angry in a way he hadn't expected. He told her he had a spare hose in the truck. It wasn't true, but he said it anyway because standing there doing nothing felt worse than lying. Mara thanked him, her voice flat, professional. She wasn't wearing a wedding ring. He noticed that before he could stop himself, and then hated that he had noticed at all. Juniper called out from the truck, asking if they could go home soon. Her voice carried across the cold air, bright and impatient, her little brown face pressed against the window. Mara turned toward the sound, and something shifted in her expression. Not sadness exactly, something closer to recognition or loss. She asked Elias if that was his daughter. He said yes and didn't offer anything else. Elias went back to the truck and lied to Juniper about the hose. She asked if the police officer was in trouble. Elias said no, just car trouble. Juniper said that was okay because police officers helped people. So it was good that they were helping her back. The logic was simple, the kind only a 7-year-old could manage without bitterness. He stood outside the truck longer than needed, pretending to look through the toolbox. The truth was, he didn't have a spare hose. And even if he did, he wasn't sure he could stand there long enough to install it. His hands were shaking, not from the cold, but from something older, something he thought he had buried under years of routine and discipline. Mara appeared beside him. She asked if he was all right. Elias told her he was fine, which was the easiest lie he had told all day. She didn't believe him. She said she was sorry for the inconvenience, that she would wait for the tow truck, that he didn't need to stay. Elias told her he didn't have the hose. The words came out harder than he meant them to. Mara's expression didn't change. She said that was fine, that she appreciated him stopping anyway. Then she asked if Juniper was his only child. The question felt like a test. Elias said yes. Mara nodded slowly and looked back toward the truck where Juniper's face was pressed against the window, her beaded braids catching the weak winter light. The wind carried the smell of frozen earth from the fields beyond the road. Elias remembered that smell from every winter of his life. He had hated it once, back when he thought he might leave Briar Hill and follow Mara to the city. But he had stayed, and the smell had become something else, a reminder that some things didn't change. His father had worked this land, and his grandfather before that. The Ward family had been farming these acres since just after the Civil War, when freedom had meant carving out something of their own from nothing. Mara said she had moved back to Briar Hill 2 weeks ago, casually, like it didn't matter. Elias felt the words land in his chest, heavy and cold. He asked why. Mara said she had been reassigned, that the department needed someone with her experience. She didn't say how long she would be staying. Elias told her the tow truck would come eventually, that she should stay in the cruiser to keep warm. Mara thanked him again, and this time there was something else in her voice, something that sounded almost like regret. Elias didn't want to hear it. He turned back toward his truck, but before he reached the door, the memory hit him, sharp and unbidden. 12 years ago, the night before Mara left for college, they had driven out to the lake at the edge of town. It was late August, the air still warm but carrying the first hint of autumn. They sat on the hood of his truck, watching the stars come out one by one. The same stars their ancestors had used to navigate north to freedom. Mara had been quiet all evening. Elias told her it would be fine, that they would make it work. The distance didn't mean anything when two people wanted the same things. Mara had turned to look at him, her face serious, the moonlight catching the gold undertones of her brown skin. She said she believed him. She said Briar Hill was still home, that he was still home. Elias had kissed her, tasting the cherry chapstick she always wore, feeling the softness of her locks against his hand. Before they left the lake, he told her he would wait. It didn't matter how long it took. Mara promised she would come back. She promised a lot of things that night, and Elias had believed every one of them because he didn't know any better. He blinked, and the memory dissolved. He climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine without looking back. Juniper asked if the police officer was going to be okay. Elias said yes. Juniper asked if they would see her again. Elias said he didn't know, which was another lie. Briar Hill was small, and Mara was a cop. Of course they would see her again. The question wasn't if, but how long he could keep pretending it didn't matter. He pulled back onto the road and drove toward the farm. Juniper chattered about school, about her friend Emma's new puppy, about her art project. Elias listened without hearing, his mind still caught on the image of Mara standing beside her cruiser, looking at him like she had something to say, but didn't know how to start. By the time they reached the farm, the sun was low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the barn and the pasture where the cows stood in their slow, patient clusters. Juniper ran ahead toward the old farmhouse, its white paint weathered but well-maintained. The same house Elias's great-grandfather had built with his own hands. Elias stood in the driveway, breathing in the cold air. The farm was the only thing that had ever made sense to him. He had built a life here, a good life, one that didn't require him to think about what he had lost. But now Mara was back, and the careful structure he had built felt suddenly fragile. Inside, Juniper was already telling Ruth about the police officer with the broken car. Ruth listened patiently, her silver-streaked locks wrapped elegantly atop her head, her dark hands steady as she stirred a pot on the stove. The kitchen smelled of collard greens and cornbread. But Ruth's eyes found Elias's over Juniper's head. She didn't ask questions, but he could see them waiting. Ruth had raised him after his parents died when he was 8, and she knew him better than anyone. Elias hung his coat by the door and went upstairs. His room was plain and functional, with family photographs lining the walls, generations of wards who had worked this land, their faces serious and proud. He sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the floor, trying to make sense of what had happened. Mara was back. That was the only fact that mattered, and it was the one fact he didn't know what to do with. Elias saw Mara again 3 days later at the farmer's market. He had taken Juniper to pick up feed and let her choose something from the baked goods table, the way they did every weekend. Miss Lucille was there with her sweet potato pies, and Brother Marcus had his honey and preserves laid out on a checkered cloth. When he turned the corner past the vegetable stands, Mara was there, holding a small jar up to the light. She saw him at the same moment he saw her. Then Juniper tugged on his hand, asking if they could get cinnamon rolls. And the moment broke. Mara walked toward them, her stride steady. She was in jeans and a dark jacket, but Elias could see the badge clipped to her belt. She said hello to Juniper first, crouching down and asking her name. Juniper answered without hesitation, telling Mara about the cinnamon rolls and how her dad always let her pick 2 if she promised to share one with Ruth. Mara smiled, the kind of smile that looked almost real, and said that sounded like a good deal. Elias stayed quiet. Mara stood and looked at him, her expression careful. She said it was good to see him again. Elias told Juniper they needed to keep moving, that Ruth was waiting. Juniper waved goodbye to Mara, and they walked away toward the truck. But distance didn't last. The following Tuesday, Mara showed up at the farm. She pulled into the driveway in her cruiser just after noon, when Elias was fixing fence near the barn. She stepped out and explained there had been reports of livestock theft. 3 farms in 2 weeks. The department was doing check-ins. She said it like routine, like she hadn't chosen to come here herself. When she finished, he told her he would keep the barn locked. Mara nodded, but didn't leave. She looked past him toward the pasture and said the place looked good, that he had done well with it. Elias didn't know what to say. Mara turned back toward her cruiser, but before she opened the door, she asked if he ever thought about leaving. The question caught him off guard. He asked what she meant. Mara said she meant the farm, Briar Hill, all of it. Elias told her no. This was where he belonged. Mara looked at him for a long moment. Then she said she was glad one of them had figured that out. She got in the cruiser and drove away. That night, after Juniper was asleep, Ruth asked him about the visit. Elias told her it was a routine check. Ruth didn't look convinced. She set a cup of tea in front of him and sat down. The kitchen was quiet, except for the old clock ticking on the wall. Ruth said she knew who Mara was. She had known the moment Juniper mentioned the police officer. She said Mara's return must be hard for him. Elias said it wasn't, that it had been 10 years and people moved on. Ruth didn't argue. She asked him if he was protecting Juniper or protecting himself. Elias didn't answer. The next time he saw Mara, Juniper was with him at the hardware store. Juniper was in the paint aisle, holding color samples up to her skin, when Mara walked in. She was in uniform this time. Mara walked over and said hello to Juniper, who asked if she had fixed her car. Mara said yes, it was working perfectly now. Then she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small plastic badge, the kind they gave to kids at community events. She handed it to Juniper and told her it was an honorary deputy badge. Juniper's face went bright with excitement. She thanked Mara 3 times, holding the badge like gold, her dimples deep in her brown cheeks. Elias watched and felt something crack open inside him. Mara glanced at him, just for a second, and he saw the question there. On the drive home, Juniper asked why Elias didn't like Officer Mara. She said it was the way he looked at her, like he was angry, but trying not to be. Elias told her he wasn't angry, that he just didn't know Mara very well. Juniper said Mara seemed nice, and maybe they could get to know her better. Elias kept his eyes on the road, ignoring the weight of the plastic badge sitting between them. 2 weeks passed, and Mara became part of the landscape. She was at the diner when Elias stopped for coffee. She was driving past the farm. She was at the church on Sunday morning, sitting in the back pew, her head bowed during prayer. She was everywhere. Elias started avoiding town, taking the long way home, skipping the farmer's market. But it didn't matter. Briar Hill was too small. One evening, just after dark, Elias was behind the barn replacing rotted fence when headlights swept across the field. A cruiser pulled up, and Mara stepped out with her flashlight. She called out, asking if everything was all right. Elias told her it was, that he was just fixing fence. Mara walked closer, her boots crunching on frozen ground. She said she had seen the light and wanted to make sure it wasn't anything suspicious. Elias said he appreciated it, but he was fine. Mara didn't leave. She stood there, her flashlight aimed at the ground, and the silence stretched between them. Then Mara spoke, quieter. She said she owed him an explanation. Elias told her she didn't owe him anything. Mara said that wasn't true, that she had left without saying why, and that had been wrong. Elias felt anger rise in his chest. He told her it had been 10 years, that whatever she had to say didn't matter anymore. Mara looked at him, her face pale in the dim light. She said it mattered to her. Then she said something that made his hand stop moving. She said she had been pregnant when she left. The words hung in the air. Elias stared at her. Mara kept talking, her voice strained. She said she had found out a week after he proposed over the phone that she had been terrified. Before she could tell him, she had lost the baby. Elias felt the ground shift beneath him. He asked why she hadn't told him. Mara said she didn't know how, that she had been 21 and scared. Losing the baby had felt like proof she wasn't meant for that life. She said leaving him was the worst thing she had ever done, and she wasn't asking for forgiveness. She just wanted him to know the truth. Elias turned away, his hands gripping the fence post so hard his knuckles went white. He thought about his mother, how she used to say that God didn't give you more than you could handle. But sometimes, He gave you just enough to break you down so you could be built back up stronger. He told Mara she should have trusted him, that he would have been there. Mara said she knew that now, but back then, all she could see was how young and unprepared she was. He told her she should go. Mara didn't argue. She said she was sorry. Then she walked back to the cruiser and drove away, leaving Elias alone with a truth he didn't know how to carry. 9.5 years ago, Elias had driven 3 hours to the city to meet Mara at a coffee shop near her campus. He had called her the week before and asked her to marry him, the words clumsy and rushed. Mara had said yes, her voice breaking. Elias had taken his grandmother's ring, the one his grandfather had given 50 years before, and driven to the city, imagining the moment he would slide it onto her finger. But when he walked into the coffee shop, Mara was already sitting at a table near the window, her face pale and distant. before he could say anything. She stopped him. She said she couldn't do it, that she had made a mistake, that she wasn't ready. Elias asked what had changed. Mara didn't answer. She pushed the ring back across the table. Elias sat there for a long time after she left. The barista had to ask him to leave when they closed. He sat in his truck in the parking lot until midnight, hoping Mara would come back. She didn't, and Elias drove home alone, the ring still in his pocket. The memory faded, and he was back behind the barn. He looked down at his hands and realized they were shaking. He thought about the baby Mara had lost, the one he had never known about, and felt something break inside him that he didn't know how to fix. 3 days later, Elias heard at the feed store that Mara had been offered a promotion. She would be moving to a lieutenant position in the city, probably within the month. The news landed like a punch. Of course she would leave again. That was what Mara did. She built things and walked away from them. He went home and threw himself into work, fixing things that didn't need fixing, staying out in the fields until dark. Ruth watched from the kitchen window. Juniper asked if he was mad. He told her no, he was just busy. But the truth was, he was preparing himself for the same loss. And this time, he told himself, it wouldn't hurt as much, because he already knew how it ended. Elias spent the next week avoiding anything that might bring him into contact with Mara. He sent Ruth into town for groceries. He skipped the farmer's market. He stayed on the farm from sunrise to well past dark. On Thursday evening, Elias was in the barn, checking feed inventory, when a cruiser pulled into the driveway. Mara stepped out and called his name. Elias walked to the doorway, keeping his expression blank. Mara stood a few feet away, still in uniform. She looked tired, the kind of tired that came from more than a long shift. She said she needed to talk to him. Elias told her there was nothing left to say. Mara said there was something he needed to know before he heard it elsewhere. She said she had been offered the promotion, the one everyone was talking about. It would mean moving back to the city, a position as lieutenant. Elias nodded, his jaw tight. He told her congratulations. But Mara didn't leave. She said she had turned it down. Elias asked why. Mara said because she wasn't running anymore, that she had spent 10 years trying to outrun the person she used to be. Briar Hill was where she needed to be, not because of him, but because it was the only place she had ever felt like herself. Elias told her she was making a mistake, that she had worked too hard to throw it away. Mara said that wasn't for him to decide. She was telling him because he deserved to know, because she owed him honesty, even if it came too late. Elias looked at her and saw something unexpected. She wasn't the girl who had left him 10 years ago. She was someone else now. Someone who had made her choice and was willing to live with it. He wanted to be angry, but the anger wouldn't come. All he felt was exhaustion. Mara said she would stay out of his way. She understood if he didn't want anything to do with her. Then she turned and walked back toward the cruiser. Elias watched her go, and for the first time in weeks, something shifted inside him. Something that felt almost like relief. That night, Ruth asked what Mara had wanted. Elias told her the truth, that Mara was staying, that she had turned down the promotion. Ruth asked what he was going to do about it. Elias said there was nothing to do. Ruth looked at him with the quiet patience she had always had. She asked if he was still protecting Juniper or just protecting himself. Elias didn't answer. Ruth set a hand on his shoulder and told him that fear was a poor reason to turn away from something real. She said Juniper needed more than safety. She needed to see him take a risk, to show her that love was worth the possibility of pain. Elias said he didn't know if he could do that. Ruth said she thought he could, but he had to decide for himself. He went upstairs and lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. He thought about Juniper, about the way she looked at Mara with open trust. He thought about the plastic badge she still carried in her backpack. He thought about the life he had built, careful and controlled, and realized it had never been about protecting Juniper. It had always been about protecting himself from the one thing he couldn't control: loss. 2 days later, on Saturday morning, Elias was fixing fence along the north pasture when Mara's cruiser came up the driveway. She got out and walked toward him, not in uniform, just jeans and a jacket. She stopped a few feet away and said she was sorry for showing up, unannounced. Elias told her it was fine. Mara said she had been thinking about what she wanted to say, that she had practiced it a dozen times, but none of it felt right. Elias waited. Mara took a breath and said she wasn't asking him to forgive her. She didn't expect him to trust her, but she wanted him to know she wasn't leaving. Not this time. She said she had made a choice 10 years ago out of fear, and it had been wrong. She couldn't undo it. Couldn't be the person he needed her to be then. But she could be someone different now. Someone who stayed, who showed up, who didn't run when things got hard. She said if he didn't want that, she would understand. But she wasn't going to disappear just because it was easier. Elias looked at her, and for the first time since she had come back, he let himself see the truth. She wasn't asking for a second chance. She was offering one, not to him, but to both of them. A chance to build something that didn't rely on the past. He thought about what Ruth had said, about taking a risk. Elias asked Mara if she wanted coffee. The words came out simple, almost casual, but they felt heavier than anything he had said in years. Mara looked at him, surprise flickering across her face. She said yes, she would like that. Elias gestured toward the house, and they walked together across the yard, the silence between them no longer sharp, but something softer. Inside, Ruth was at the kitchen table with Juniper, helping her with a coloring book. Juniper looked up and smiled at Mara, holding up her picture. Mara crouched down to look at it, complimenting the colors, and Juniper beamed. Ruth met Elias's eyes over their heads, her expression warm and knowing. He made coffee, the act grounding him. Mara sat at the table, answering Juniper's questions about police work, about whether she had ever arrested a bad guy. She answered patiently, kindly, and Elias realized this was what he had been afraid of. Not that Mara would leave again, but that she would stay, and he would have to decide whether he was brave enough to let her. When the coffee was ready, Elias set a cup in front of Mara and sat down. Juniper asked if Mara could come back and visit again. Mara said she would like that, if it was okay with Elias. Juniper looked at her father, eyes wide and hopeful. Elias said it was okay. Ruth stood and said she needed to check on something in the barn, taking Juniper with her. The door closed, and Elias and Mara were alone. Mara wrapped her hands around the cup. She said she didn't expect this to be easy. Elias said he knew that too. Mara asked if he thought it was worth trying. Elias looked out the window at the fields, at the barn, at the life he had built from the ruins of what he thought he had lost. He said he didn't know, but he was willing to find out. Mara nodded, and something in her expression softened. Something that looked almost like hope. They sat there in the quiet kitchen, drinking coffee, not saying much, but it was enough. it was a start. 3 months later, the farm looked the same, but the rhythm of it had changed. Mara came by on her days off, helping with repairs, sitting with Juniper while Elias worked. She didn't push, didn't ask for more than he was ready to give. And slowly the walls he had built began to come down. Juniper adored her, and Ruth approved in her quiet way. On Sundays, Mara joined them at church, sitting with the family in the pew Elias's grandmother had claimed decades before. The congregation welcomed her back with the warmth that small black churches knew how to give. Elias found himself looking forward to the sound of Mara's car in the driveway, to the easy conversation, to the moments when their hands would brush and neither would pull away. It wasn't perfect. There were still days when the past felt too heavy, when he wondered if he was making a mistake. But there were more days when it felt right, when he looked at Mara and saw not the girl who had left him, but the woman who had chosen to stay. One evening, after Juniper had gone to bed, Elias and Mara sat on the porch, watching the sun set over the fields. The sky was painted in shades of orange and purple, the same sky their ancestors had watched over this same land. Mara said she was glad she had come back. Elias said he was too, and realized he meant it. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and he let her, the weight of it familiar and grounding. He thought about love, about the way it required risk, required trust, required the willingness to be hurt again. And he thought maybe that was the point, not to avoid the pain, but to choose the possibility of something real, even knowing it might not last. Elias looked out at the fields, at the life he had built, and knew it was no longer just his. It was theirs, fragile and uncertain, but growing stronger every day. And that, he thought, was enough.